We've been on a sermon series for the last couple weeks about couples in the Bible, and we've looked at Adam and Eve, and we've looked at Abraham and Sarah. We've talked even some about Noah. We don't know the name of Noah's wife. Do you remember that? Her name, we just called her Mrs. Noah because the Bible doesn't give her a name. There's another example in the Bible like that, and it is in the story of Job. Everyone knows, I think, the story of Job, or somewhat familiar with it. But Job has a wife. And she only has one line in the entire book of Job, which is a pretty long book. But it's an important line. She gets a bad rap in some ways. We're going to read what she says here, but try to withhold judgment of her as you read or listen to the text. And I think there's something important that we can learn from Job and his wife about marriage and about how we respond when bad things happen to good people. Listen for the word of the Lord. One day the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. He still persists in his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him for no reason." Then Satan answered the Lord, "Skin for skin. All that people have, they will give to save their lives. But stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and flesh, and he will curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well. He is in your power, only spare his life." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and inflicted loathsome sores on Job from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. Job took a potsherd from which to scrape himself and sat among the ashes. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still persist in your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as any foolish woman would speak. Shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not receive the bad?" In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. This is the word of the Lord. Job is a good man. And Job's wife, Mrs. Job, is a good woman. The Bible says here, and this stretches the imagination for a lot of Protestants, but the Bible says that Job is blameless, upright, fears God, and turns away from evil. Those four things. Now, any one of those would be remarkable. If he just feared God, that would be pretty special. If he was just blameless, that would be unique and wonderful. If he just turned away from evil, that would make him pretty awesome. But the Bible says he is all four. Job and his wife live a righteous life. They give to charity. The Bible says that they take care of all the widows and the orphans living in the town around them. They go to church every Sunday. They are good parents. They are good spouses to each other. They have 10 children. They have good relationships with all 10 of their children. And here's the kicker. All 10 of those children get along with each other. Now that, by itself, is a miracle. But you put all this together, and Job is a man who lives a perfect life in every possible way. And his wife lives it with him. She's part of this. But then what happens is one day, Job and Mrs. Job are sitting on the couch at home. The mail comes. It's a letter from their financial advisor. They open up the letter, and the letter says, "Your 401k, your retirement, your savings, all of your investments, they're gone. You've lost everything. You don't even have anything to live on anymore." As soon as they finish reading that letter from their financial advisor, the doorbell rings. They get up and they walk to the door. They open it. There's a man in a uniform standing there. And the man in the uniform, policeman, fireman, whatever you like to imagine, He says, I'm sorry to inform you, Job and Mrs. Job, but all 10 of your children have died in a terrible accident. That's what happens to Job and his wife. The next day, Job wakes up in the morning with a terrible illness. They go to the doctor, but the doctor can't say what it is or explain why he's sick, and there is no treatment for it. This story is full of all sorts of extremes, isn't it? Both, on the one hand, Job's righteousness just seems unbelievable, too perfect for reality, and his suffering seems too extreme. And there's a reason for that. See, the person who wrote the book of Job was not writing a biography of a historical person. The author of the book of Job is doing a thought experiment, a theological test case. The author of Job must have been an interesting person. He must have been something of a rebellious spirit, because he wrote, or she maybe, wrote the book of Job to counter what was the traditional dogma of the time. People in the time when Job was written believed these two principles that sound by themselves very reasonable. They believed that God is just. They also believed that God rules the earth according to that justice. But when you put those two things together, then you have something like this proverb: Behold, the righteous shall be recompensed in the earth, much more the wicked and the sinner. So God's just, and God runs the show. So God rewards the good, and God punishes the wicked. If God's just, and he's in charge, then the good get rewarded, and the evil don't. Whoever wrote the book of Job wrote it to test this, to counter it, to challenge it, to ask the question, well, what if bad things happen to good people? And that's why the author makes Job so extremely good. If you're a Protestant and you believe all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, you read your Romans, that's fine. You have to lay that aside today. Job is a good man, and he is blameless and upright, and he fears God, and he shuns evil. All four. Job is without sin, and his suffering, therefore, can't be deserved. Now, some Christians today will say, bad things can't happen to good people because there are no good people. And they'll quote their Bible, and they'll quote Paul, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And they'll tell you that every person is born a sinner, born deserving God's wrath. So technically, no bad things happen to truly good people. But that's not what Job is about. And if you believe that, by the way, there's churches right here in Nampa, big ones, who teach this. And I'm not exaggerating it in the slightest. But if you believe that way and you can't set it aside, you will never, ever understand the book of Job. Job is a good man, and his suffering is unjust, and it's undeserved, and it's unfair. So Job has some options. Now, his first option is given to him by his friends. His friends come and they sit with him. They sit with him and they do what my daughter said. They shut their mouths for a while. And that's great until they start to talk. And then they ruin everything. By the way, that's the first lesson for the book of Job. If you know someone who's going through something, the best thing you can do is go sit with them and don't speak. But Job's friends then presented him his first option, and that is to believe a lie, to defend the dogma, to accept that Job must have sinned because everything happens for a reason. That's his friend's advice. God is just and God rules the world. So if this happened to you, Job, there must be a reason. There must be a plan. At some point you must have sinned to bring this upon you. Just confess. and all will be right. That's the first option. But Job will not do it. And let's think about everything happens for a reason for a minute. I think it's my pastoral duty to talk about that phrase. People say it, and it makes some people feel better. And if it makes you feel better when you've gone through something, that's good for you. But I'm not sure it's the best thing to say. And here's why. Because if you ask someone who says that, when something horrible happens, like someone loses their 10 children, you could ask them, well, if everything happens for a reason, what was the reason? And I don't know what it would be, but it can't be a good one. And if you say, well, it was God's plan, well, couldn't an all-powerful God make a better plan than that? And then if they say, well, it's a plan that's mysterious and we can't understand it, well, then that's not a reason, is it? Because a reason, by definition, if you look up the word reason, is something we can understand. So I'm not sure everything does happen for a reason. But there's a problem that's even more important than this. And G.K. Chesterton was a Catholic theologian and philosopher, and he wrote an essay on the book of Job, which is wonderful. I recommend it. But he said that the real problem in the book of Job has to do with what happens when we look at the world this way. If you believe that God is just and God rules the world according to that justice and rewards the good and punishes the wicked, then when you wake up in the morning and you walk out in the world or you turn on the news and you see what's going on, you're going to look at the people who are doing great and you're going to assume that they must be good. After all, they're rewarded. But even worse, you're going to look at the world and all the people who are unfortunate, and you're going to think, they didn't get rewarded. They got bad things. God's running the show. Maybe they did something wrong. And so this is what Chesterton wrote. He said, if prosperity is regarded as the reward of virtue, it will be regarded as the symptom of virtue. Men will leave off the heavy task of making good men successful. He will adopt the easier task of falsely making out successful men as if they were good. If you have this mentality, if you subscribe to this dogma that the book of Job was written to counter, then when you look at the world, you're going to assume that good men or that prosperous men must be good, and you're going to assume that unfortunate men and women, well, they must have done something wrong. They must be lazy. And for Chesterton, it's our responsibility to make sure that good people are rewarded and that wicked people are brought to justice. If we believe that God already does this for us, then we won't do it at all. We'll just assume that the fortunate are good morally and that the unfortunate are bad morally. But there is another option that Job is given, and this one is from his wife. Curse God and die. I said earlier that she gets a bad reputation. The first thing I want to point out is that Job's suffering isn't just his. Other than his illness, Job's wife has lost everything too. She has lost her security, her future. She has lost her children. So when she says this, she says it out of a grief that's every bit as strong as Job's. Her suffering isn't any less than his. But for her, she has the same information that the friends do. She knows that her husband is a good man, and she knows that his suffering, that the death of their children, she knows that it is unjust. So she has the same information, but she takes a different turn than the friends. The friends are going to insist that Job must not be righteous, that he must deserve it, that there must be a reason. What Job's wife does instead is she crosses out number 1. For her, obviously, God is in charge. And she knows that her husband is a good man. So if God's in charge and her husband's suffering isn't just, then God must not be acting justly. God must not be just. And so for her, what else can a mortal do if God isn't going to act right? Just give up. There's no other options. And I've noticed something. There are a lot of atheists today. In the time when Job was written, I don't think atheism was really an option. I don't think Job's wife ever considered the possibility that God could just not exist. So she just comes to the conclusion that he must not be just. Today, it's more common to think of this possibility, but I like to talk with folks who are atheists, and when I ask them, why, the explanation I get more often than not is that they'll say something like this: if you look at the world, there's a ton of unjust suffering. So I just don't think God exists then. But when you think about that, I find this fascinating. When you think about the reasoning behind that atheism, isn't it really atheism in defense of God? They're looking at the world and they're saying there's all this unjust suffering, and rather than conclude, well, God must just not be a very good guy, they choose instead to conclude that he doesn't exist. That's the choice they're making. Better for them to look at the world and say, God just isn't there, than to say, well, God is allowing all of this. It's atheism, folks, in defense of God, in defense of God's character. They may not think of it that way explicitly. They may not say it that way, but when you listen to their reasoning, that's what they're doing. That's the move they're making. They're seeing the injustice in the world, and rather than doing Job's wife's option, they're saying, well, there's no God. Now, Job rejects his friends' advice, and he doesn't take his wife's either. Job takes a third option, and for him it is the only option available to him, and that is to complain very loudly, to shout at God, to shake his fist at God, and to say, God, I know that you are better than this, and I know that this is wrong, and you should do something about it, and I will not shut up until you make this right. And that's what Job does for 40 chapters, practically. To complain and to shout and to cry out to God, to demand justice from God. That's Job's only option. That's what he does. And you know what happens at the end of the book of Job? God finally shows up and he says to Job's friends, you were wrong. Everything doesn't happen for a reason. Not only that, but God is so angry with Job's friends for clinging to their dogma that he threatens to smite them. And God only spares their lives because Job prays for his friends after they were such miserable comforters. And there's a message here, I think, that there are things that are more important than our religious beliefs. That compassion comes before answers. Because that's what Job's friends are doing. They are defending their religion over and above having compassion for their friend. We take marriage vows. And we say something like this. I think most of us have. When we take these vows, we say, for better or for worse, and in sickness and in health. But what we don't always think about is that the same exact worse or the same exact sickness, the same exact tragedy can come upon a couple, and the husband and the wife will respond to it in two very different ways. That's what happens with Job and Mrs. Job. They have taken the same loss and felt the same pain, and Mrs. Job responds to it one way, and Job responds to it in another. When I was in seminary, some of you heard this story before. It's one of the most impactful things that ever happened to me. I was working as a chaplain at the local hospital, and I had to be on call for the emergency room one day a week like all the other chaplains did. And one night I was on call. The emergency room at the hospital called me to come down to the ER because a 2-year-old girl had come in. This 2-year-old girl, she'd been at home with her mom. Her mom had fixed her dinner. Her dad was working late at night. He was on his way home, but he wasn't home yet. She was eating dinner. Her mom walked out of the room to use the restroom. When she had come back, she found that her daughter had choked on a grape. She came into the emergency room in an ambulance, and she was dead on arrival. The mom was there. I found her in the waiting room. The dad was still on his way home from work, so we waited until the father arrived, and then we took them into a room, and I sat with them while the doctor explained to them that their 2-year-old girl was dead. We then took her body into a chapel, and we spent a couple hours praying, telling stories, reading scriptures, comforting the family as best we could. They all went home, and then it came time to move the body. And the chaplain's job, this happens after everyone's gone, the chaplain's job is to sit there with the body until transport comes. Transport is like an 18-year-old kid who's getting paid minimum wage. That's part of why the chaplain stays. I remember this young man. He had to walk in there. He had to move the body of a 2-year-old little girl, take her to the morgue. You ever seen a hospital morgue? There's those ugly UV fluorescent lights, and it's a wall. It's a wall of solid metal with doors on it, and it's cold. And this young man had to take the body of this 2-year-old girl and pull out one of the drawers, and behind that drawer is like a metal slab. Lay her body on it, and then shut the door. And I sat there until he was done. And when I heard the door close, and that 2-year-old little girl was sitting in the cold and dark, when just hours before she'd been eating dinner with her mother, I almost cursed God. But I think of that husband and wife pretty often, and I wonder how they responded to it. Did the mom blame herself for leaving the room? Did the dad think to himself, if only I hadn't been working so late? If only I had been there? And I wonder how they responded to this tragedy. Did they shake their fist at God? Did one of them become an atheist? Did one of them search for reasons or a mysterious plan? I don't know, but I wouldn't judge any of those responses in them, because the book of Job teaches me that compassion comes before dogma. I will tell you the only 2 things I know about what happened that day. The first thing I know is that little girl's death was unjust and unfair. And the second thing I know is that I can demand that God make it right. That's what Job did, and God approved. If God raised Jesus from the dead, then someday I will see that little girl, and I will look for her to be with her parents. And until then, I will raise a clamor with God until I know it's